Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're bypassing the usual surface-level fandom to definitively dissect arguably the most iconic 90s pop culture debate of all time. We aren't just taking sides here. We're going to break down this monumental television moment through hard facts, creator intent, and, believe it or not, actual clinical psychology. Okay, let's get right into it. Were Ross and Rachel really on a break? It's the legendary question that has divided audiences, friend groups, and even real-life couples for decades. Literally, it's the 6 words that defined a whole generation of television. But what actually happened that night? And more importantly, who was really in the right? First things first, we gotta map out the actual objective timeline of that fateful anniversary night. So it starts with Rachel being just completely overwhelmed with her new job at Bloomingdale's. Ross shows up, gets wildly jealous of her coworker Mark, and they have this massive fight that culminates with Rachel asking for a break from us. Later that night, Ross calls to make up, right? But he hears Mark's voice in Rachel's apartment. Heartbroken and immediately assuming the absolute worst, Ross gets incredibly drunk at a bar and ends up sleeping with Chloe, the hot girl from the Xerox place. And then, the very next morning, Rachel comes over to get back together, entirely unaware of what Ross has just done. Now fans use this exact timeline to fiercely argue both sides of the divide. The We're Broken Up camp loves to point out that Rachel didn't exactly stop Mark from coming over, which, remember, is the very guy Ross was jealous of to begin with. Plus, she explicitly went over the next morning asking to be his girlfriend again, which definitely implies they had actually ceased to be a couple. But then you have the We're Not Broken Up camp. They argue that Rachel never actually used the words break up. She just said take a break. Oh, and they also point out that Ross immediately went to great lengths to hide what he did, which, let's be honest, looks a whole lot like an admission of guilt. But hey, we don't just have to guess about public opinion here. We actually have some hard data. The dating app Plenty of Fish polled 1,865 singles to get a definitive modern consensus on this exact issue. And the results? A clear 60% majority sided with Ross, agreeing that yes, technically they were on a break when the incident happened, while 40% held the line that they absolutely were not. However, it gets even more fascinating when you dig into the demographics of that exact same poll. There is a massive gender divide. When asked if Ross's actions constituted cheating, 44% of women stated that Ross cheated, compared to only 36% of men. This really shows us how our views on the rules of a relationship break are deeply subjective and honestly often split right down gender lines. But audience opinion is really just the first layer of this whole debate. Layer 2, the creators and the critics. Let's peel back the curtain a bit and look at the television writing mechanics behind all this madness. What did the people who actually created the show intend? Take executive producer Kevin Bright. He gave a pretty definitive yet kind of nuanced answer. He confirms, yeah, there was a break, but you really have to look at the second part of his quote. They weren't on a break with honor. So he acknowledges that while the break was technically on, moving on with someone else mere hours later completely violates the unspoken rules of a relationship pause. But then, sharply contrasting that, you've got co-creator David Crane. He just flat out refuses to answer the question. He revealed that from a writing standpoint, the showrunners deliberately designed this entire scenario to be an unsolvable argument. Creating a situation where both characters are a little bit right and a little bit wrong, that is the absolute holy grail of sitcom writing because it generates literally years of narrative tension. And this deliberate ambiguity culminated in what critics call one of the best scenes in the entire series. It's this cinematically weighty breakup scene, filled with just devastating dialogue. Ross pleads, "This can't be it," and Rachel so coldly replies, "Then how come it is?" The sheer brilliance of the writing is that this incredibly raw, realistic argument is made 1,000 times more tense because the rest of the gang is trapped in Monica's bedroom, eavesdropping while forced to eat organic waxing hair removal product just to survive. It is the perfect blend of high-stakes drama and total sitcom absurdity. All right, layer 3. The clinical psychology verdict. Let's elevate these characters from sitcom tropes to real psychological subjects on a therapist's couch. So, real-life relationship therapist Dana McNeil actually analyzed the episode, and she diagnosed both Ross and Rachel in that exact moment as being flooded. Now, if you aren't familiar, flooding is a state of fight or flight where your prefrontal cortex literally just shuts down. Because Rachel was so overwhelmed by work and Ross was so consumed by jealousy, neither of them actually had the cognitive ability to make a rational, binding decision about their relationship. And because of this flooded state, McNeil offers her professional verdict. They were technically not on a break.
Think about it. They never defined the terms of the separation, there was zero timeline established, and frankly, neither of them was in a mental state to negotiate a proper breakup. Plus, she makes a great point that Ross initially rejected Chloe's advances at the bar, which pretty clearly indicates his subconscious heart knew he was still in a committed relationship.
Which perfectly sets up our final and honestly deepest layer. We aren't just talking about a therapist watching TV anymore. There is an actual peer-reviewed academic paper published in the Journal of Literature and Art Studies by Zhao Maojian that dives into the psychoanalytic perspectives of these characters. It looks specifically at how the childhood traumas driving their behavior cause this totally inevitable explosion. When you compare their clinical profiles from the paper, you are basically looking at a recipe for absolute disaster. Ross was raised by his parents as a medical miracle, which created this intense striving for superiority complex. He was constantly praised, meaning he developed an absolute inability to handle failure or rejection. Now, juxtapose that against Rachel's upbringing. She was a wealthy, spoiled cheerleader completely reliant on her renowned doctor father. She lacked independence and just expected all of her whims to be immediately indulged by everyone around her. So you put these two profiles together in that apartment on their anniversary, and what do you get? A massive psychoanalytic collision. Ross's deep-seated paranoia flares up because Rachel is finally gaining real career independence, which directly threatens his superior role. Then when they argue, his mind literally cannot handle the failure of the relationship, causing him to aggressively spiral out of control. Meanwhile, Rachel's ingrained princess tendency kicks in. She expects Ross to simply indulge her sudden whim to take a break without any questions or consequences. The tragedy here wasn't just some goofy sitcom misunderstanding. It was a devastating clash of two deeply flawed psychological profiles fighting over independence and control. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from all of this. I mean, we project so much on Ross and Rachel because, let's face it, we see ourselves in them. So the next time you find yourself reflecting on your own relationship arguments, maybe ask yourself, was it really just a bad night? Or were you actually flooded, acting out your own deeply rooted psychological complexes? It is definitely a question worth asking before you ever suggest taking a break.